Okay, so chapter 12 on religion, and a lot of Hobbes's basic ideas already came up at the end of chapter 11, and we talked about them there. Basically, anxiety about our good and ill fortune causes us, basically, he says, cause and effect. Anxiety about the future causes us to seek after causes, to understand, to want to know the cause of things, and especially, obviously, the cause of our own good and ill fortune. It makes us wonder, why are things happening? Why did something good happen to us? Why did something bad happen to us? Again, we can use the example of sickness. Why, if I get seriously ill, I wonder, why did I get ill? And it's not just an abstract kind of reasoning. Well, why did this happen? It's an interesting intellectual puzzle or something. The idea is, why did this happen, so I can stop it from happening again? And Hobbes says, and since we often don't really understand causes, again, especially for most of human history, before Hobbes would say, before the rise of modern science, and even to a large extent in Hobbes' own day, and even some today, Hobbes would say, because human beings don't always have a true understanding of actual causes, they imagine things, and then they come up with sort of powers invisible, as he puts it. The imagination, which again, to some extent is correct. If I got sick, maybe I got sick because of bacteria, but of course Hobbes says we don't just, when people start imagining powers invisible, they're not just thinking in terms of bacteria or something like that. They're thinking in terms of some kind of a force, some sort of a basically sentient, sort of thinking, feeling being that has desires, that has a reason why it decided to make somebody sick. And so Hobbes says, people imagine these powers invisible, and as he sarcastically puts it at the end of chapter 11, they stand in awe of their own imaginations. They sort of imagine these things that don't actually exist, and they think that they're gods and demons and so on that have control over them, and then they sort of stand in awe of them, as he puts it, and they're just sort of, they have this great sort of awestruck experience of religious devotion and so on for these things. And he says, that's sort of where religion comes from. And then he develops all of this in chapter 12 and sort of goes into more detail in his understanding of what religion is, where it comes from. So chapter 12, he starts by saying basically that as he observes, religion is distinctly human. I mean, it's true we don't fully know, what the animals are doing. It's possible that they're out there practicing religion in some way, but certainly we don't see them, building little churches or temples or anything. We don't see them praying, so far as we can tell. So it seems as if religion is peculiar to human beings, unique to human beings. So he says, therefore, whatever the cause of it is must also be unique to human beings. So he says, so what is that? What is unique to human beings? He's already answered this question in a few other places in the Leviathan, but he gives a kind of slightly different answer here. So he says, the seed of religion must be unique to human beings. So what is it? And first of all, he says, it is peculiar to the nature of man to be inquisitive into the causes of the events that they see. So he says it's unique to human nature, to human beings, to inquire about the causes that they see. They see something happen and they wonder, why did it happen? They want to understand the cause that produced the particular effect that they see, the particular event that they see. And he says also human beings, and again this seems to be unique to them, think that all things must be produced by causes. So when we see something happen, we wonder about the cause, and of course, related to that, we think it must have a cause. This thing must have happened for a reason, in the sense, not in the sense, sometimes when people say things happen for a reason, they mean, well, there's some kind of a purpose behind them, there's some sort of a, God is doing it for some reason that we may not understand, but ultimately will be for the best. That's not what it means here. Things have causes, that things happen for a reason, in the sense that they are caused by something else. And whatever we see, whatever happens to us, we can understand why it happened. If we can also, misunderstand why it happened, have a false reason have a false account of why it happened. But all things happen because of a cause. Something causes everything that happens. Something causes everything that we see. And Hobbes says, everybody inquires in that, and we also think that all things happen because they're caused by something else. So we don't think that things happen arbitrarily or randomly or for no apparent reason. If we did, that would change things. We may think, yes, terrible things happen to people, but who knows why they happen, and we have no control over it, so we should just relax. But Hobbes says people aren't like that. They're very worried about what's happening, and they want to understand why these things happen, what the causes are, so that they can hopefully control the causes and produce the causes of good things and prevent the causes of bad things. So he says, human beings seek the causes of the events that they see, and they think that all things have to be produced by causes. They think causally. And then he goes on, he says, basically animals, the other unique thing about human beings is that human beings have foresight. We think into the future. Animals don't. So animals are concerned with just with their immediate physical needs. So the example that we used earlier, the rabbit that I watched once that understood when a certain cupboard door opened, it was going to be fed and would get very excited. Hobbes would say, that animal could understand cause and effect, but once it had eaten once the rabbit had eaten, it just forgot about that. It stopped worrying about the door. It stopped thinking, well, how could I get that door to open? How could I produce being fed? How could I produce this? How could I cause this event that I like, namely getting food? How can I actually make that happen myself rather than just sitting around waiting for somebody else to do it? Hobbes says, animals don't think into the future like that. They have some basic needs: food, thirst. They have hunger, thirst, lust, and once those things are satisfied, they're just at rest and they just forget about things. Where he says human beings aren't like that. A human being eats today or eats right now and feels satisfied, but knows in a few hours I'm going to be hungry again. And knows, in 3 weeks I'm going to be hungry and I'm going to need food. And if I haven't eaten in 3 weeks, I'm going to die. And so, so human beings think into the future and think, how can I procure the things that I want? And again, and of course, again, in terms of sickness and so on, human beings think, what causes sickness? What causes, obviously you see stories about this all the time in the news and so on. What causes cancer? What causes heart disease? What can you do to prevent these things? The basic idea that, again, if we just take a simple example like physical health, what is the cause of good health? What is the cause of illness? And how can you control those things? How can you sort of produce the causes of good health, and how can you prevent the causes of ill health or sickness and so on? But he says, but that's what human beings are. They think in terms of causes. They think everything is caused by something. They wonder what it is. And then also they think into the future, and they realize that they're not secure in the future. So they have to think, well, how can I provide for myself in the future? And again, he says animals don't have that. Animals aren't worried. The squirrel isn't sitting there wondering, well, yeah, I have nuts today, but what's going to happen in next week or next summer, or what about global warming? What's going on? Animals aren't thinking into the future like that at all. So basically, he says, then in section 5, the first two make anxiety. For being assured that there be causes of all things that have arrived hitherto or shall arrive hereafter, it is impossible for a man who continually endeavoureth to secure himself against the evil he fears and procure the good he desireth, not to be in a perpetual solicitude of the time to come. So he says, again, you're worried about getting the good that you want or need, avoiding the evil that you fear. And so he says you're going to constantly be worried about the future, because sure, right now I'm fine, but what about tomorrow? What about next week? What about a year from now? And so on. We're constantly worried about the future. What is going to happen? Worrying about, job security, retirement. What, am I going to, health long term and so on. Hobbes says, we never relax. We never just say, hey, today is fine. I'm not going to worry about anything else. Human beings are always thinking into the future. And so as he says then, so that every man, especially those that are over-provident, are in an estate like to that of Prometheus. And of course, Prometheus from Greek mythology gave human beings fire as punishment. He was tied to a rock, and every day an eagle would come and eat out his liver, and at night the liver would heal, and then the next day the eagle would come and eat it again. That was his punishment from Zeus. So Hobbes sort of uses this story. He says, for as Prometheus, which interpreted is the prudent man, was bound to the hill Caucasus, a place of large prospect, where an eagle, feeding on his liver, devoured in the day as much as was repaired in the night, so that man who looks too far before him in the care of future time, hath his heart all the day long gnawed on by fear of death, poverty, or other calamity, and has no repose, nor pause of his anxiety, but in sleep. So Hobbes says, human beings being prudent, being provident, thinking about the future, he says, are basically like Prometheus, in that we might sleep, and of course in other parts of the Leviathan he mentions, sometimes if you really want something or really fear something, you won't be able to sleep because the desire or the fear is so strong. But here he says, even if you sleep, you might be refreshed from sleep, and then the next day you get up and you're worrying again about the future, you're thinking into the future. And so he says, human beings, the image of Prometheus is a good image for what human beings are like. Constantly torn apart by an eagle, by anxiety, by worry, by care for the future, briefly repaired through sleep and so on, and then the next day it all starts again. So that's what human beings are like, constantly anxious, constantly worried about the future. So then as he goes on and he says, this perpetual fear, always accompanying mankind in the ignorance of causes, as it were in the dark. So again he says, when you don't understand actual causes. Even today, we wonder, am I going to get cancer? How can I prevent that? Am I going to lose my job? And so on. But even more, when people don't understand causes, when they know that people get sick, but they don't know why, when they know a plague might descend on a town and kill half the people in it, when they know there might be a famine, all of these things, but they don't understand what the causes are, Hobbes says then the anxiety is even worse. It's even greater. It's even more intense when you don't actually understand the causes. So he says, this perpetual fear, always accompanying mankind in the ignorance of causes, as it were in the dark, must needs have for object something. So here's what he sort of says, this constant fear needs to have an object. We need to think that there's something out there that we can actually focus that fear on, not just death, but actually worry about. What is it? What is going to cause my good or ill fortune? So Hobbes says, just again, sort of part of his account of human nature is we can't just be worried about this, but just shrug it off or just be anxious and say, well, what can I do though? The anxiety needs a sort of kind of an object, as he puts it. It needs something to worry about, and again, to think ultimately something to focus on, to focus that fear and that anxiety on, and to believe that we can somehow control it, that we can somehow manage it. We can't just survive, or we can't just endure with all of this terrible anxiety. We have to find a focus for it in a way that we think that we can sort of again improve our chances, get what we want and need, avoid what we fear. So he says, and therefore, when there is nothing to be seen, there is nothing to accuse, either of their good or evil fortune, but some power or agent invisible. So he says, again, that's, the old poet said that religion originates in human fear, and he says that was true of the religion of the Gentiles, in other words, of non-Jewish, non-Christian people of antiquity. But he says that's not true of the true God. He says you can come to understand the true God through reasoning about cause and effect. So sounds something like Aquinas here, although again this looks much more like Aristotle's first mover than like the God of the Bible, this one that he identifies as the true God. He says thinking about causes, you can come to realize there must be a first cause that is not caused by anything else, is the cause of its own existence. But he says that's there. But then he goes back and he really doesn't talk about, the Bible. He doesn't say that people sense that God must exist because they sense a need for salvation, or again, as Aquinas would say, because they sense that there's some purpose in life. We've seen Hobbes rejects that. There is no summum bonum. Therefore, people are not going to know about God through sensing that there's some goal in life, some happiness that they're seeking, which turns out to be God. Hobbes says none of that is true. That there is no ultimate purpose for human life, so that's not going to lead people to awareness of God. Again, we know Aquinas thought very differently. So basically, so he says, this fear of powers powers invisible. When you don't know what's out there, then basically you sort of need to believe in something. And he says, and that's to a large extent where religion comes from. Again, he sort of accepts Christianity and the religion of the Bible. He says that's not true in that case, but that's a big part of where religion comes from. And so he goes on, and as he goes on, he says, he says basically men imagine these powers invisible, or these gods, to be like human beings. First of all, in form and substance, but eventually in emotional makeup as well. So they imagine these powers invisible, and again, they don't think of them in terms of purely impersonal things like bacteria. Or carcinogens or something. They think, well, there must be something, there must be a power invisible that is like a human being. And when they imagine them, they imagine them often as having human form. But even more than that, they imagine them as being emotionally or psychologically like human beings. And of course, what are human beings like? Especially for Hobbes, human beings are above all vain. So they imagine these gods must be vain. And the way to make them happy, and therefore to make them protect you, is to sacrifice to them, is to show them great respect, is to build temples and to speak solemnly when you pray to them, and so on. So human beings imagine that these gods are like human beings psychologically as well, and therefore the way to appease them, the way to get their protection, is basically to be somewhat subservient to them, to appeal to their sense of their own importance. But again, he goes on, he says, again, ignorance of causes produces superstition. He uses examples, the Athenians, when they had success with a general named Phormio, they wanted another leader with the same name. Same with the Romans, an expedition in Africa. They wanted someone named Scipio, because the last time they sent a general to Africa named Scipio, he won a great victory. So the Romans made the mistake of thinking, oh, well, it was because of the name Scipio. If we have the same person with the same name, then that will happen again. And of course, this is basically superstition. And again, that's what Hobbes is talking about. That you understand that there must be something that causes good or ill fortune, but you don't understand what it is, and therefore you notice some accidental thing that happened. Well, his name was Scipio, so maybe that was it. Maybe it was his name. When people watch sports, there was my uncle, for instance, in the 1970s once was only over visiting my parents, and they were watching the Cincinnati Reds, and they were all Reds fans, and the Reds were down in a game, and my uncle put a sort of heavy paperclip on his ear, and the Reds got a hit, and they ended up scoring and winning. And then whenever he would be over watching again, and the Reds were down, or they needed a hit, he would put that paperclip back on his ear, Again, obviously that had nothing to do with it. That wasn't why the Reds won. It had nothing. It had no influence on the game whatsoever. But you really want something, and you look at what you actually have within your power. Again, this is Hobbes' basic idea. When you see some goal that you want, and you think, how can I get that? And if you don't really know, you sort of look at what you have within your power, and you sort of say, well, the last time I put that paperclip on my ear, somebody got a hit, so maybe that will work. And so that's where you sort of ignorance of actual causes or inability, really. And again, it seems from some of what Hobbes is saying, even if you could explain to people, look, you have no control over this, they can't accept that. So they have to believe that somehow they have control over it, and therefore they will imagine some kind of connection between something that they've seen and something that they have some control over and the outcome that they want. So he says, ignorance of causes produces superstition. It makes us think that because X happened and then Y happened next, X must have caused Y. But that wasn't true, Hobbes says. Usually people don't really understand what the actual cause was. So they imagine things and they get things wrong. And again, and so then he goes on and he says he sort of develops the idea that people worship these powers by giving them what they imagine human beings would want, honors, respect, things like that. And then, of course, he gets into basically the idea that human beings also thought that the gods communicated through prognostication. So reading tea leaves, reading the entrails of birds, and so on. And so that's where he sort of, he sort of gives a couple different versions of the natural seed of religion. One of them is here in section 11 of chapter 12. He says, and in these four things, opinions of ghost, ignorance of second causes, devotion towards what men fear, and taking of things casual for prognostics, consisteth the natural seed of religion, which by reason of the different fancies, judgments, and passions of several men hath grown up into ceremonies so different that those which are used by one man are for the most part ridiculous to another. And then again, he sort of sarcastically maybe not sarcastically, but sort of points out, that religion is so different because people are so different, the types of ceremonies, the types of beliefs that have grown up, although they all have this common core. This fear of powers invisible, this attempt to understand how to influence them, how to tell the future, how to show them respect, and so on. They're all sort of have that common core and that common purpose. But because people are so different, all kinds of different religions that we have grown up, and the religions that one doesn't practice oneself seem ridiculous. But again, obviously, it doesn't take that much to step back and say, well, obviously, your religion looks ridiculous to someone else. That basically all people's religions sort of look ridiculous to anyone who doesn't believe that particular religion. And again, Hobbes says that's because the different types of people, the different imaginations, the different ideas that people have caused different religions to grow up. So, if an ancient Greek met an ancient Egyptian, and the ancient Greek said, well, what do you believe? And the Egyptian said, well, I believe that there's different gods that are sort of part animal, part man, and they control the afterlife, and so on. The Greek would say that's ridiculous. And the Egyptian would say, okay, well, what do you believe? And the Greek would say, I believe there's a big guy with a giant beard who lives on a mountain and throws lightning bolts. I mean, that's no more realistic or reasonable or anything like that. It's just sort of different religions. And of course, people think that whatever other people believe is ridiculous. But again, if they looked at their own beliefs, they might find them, a little bit more critically, they might find them equally ridiculous. So basically, that's the natural seed of religion. That's why it's developed differently in different areas, different religions. And he goes on then and he says in section 12 something sort of interesting. He says, basically he distinguishes between those who sort of invented religion, the Gentiles, the ancients, and those who have announced true religions, the figures from the Bible. But he says they both have the same object or the same purpose in doing so, to make men more obedient, basically to introduce a form of governance. So, I mean, interesting, he doesn't say that the prophets of the Bible, that their purpose was to tell the truth about God. He says their truth was to govern people, to introduce laws, to make people more obedient, and to govern them. And so again, what we would sort of expect from Hobbes, the emphasis here, true religion is about making people good citizens. And so basically, that's sort of what he says. You can see that he sort of assimilates Judaism and Christianity, basically the Bible, very much to ancient lawgivers and founders and so on of Rome and whatnot, and says they were all doing the same thing. Again, the difference isn't that one one group was announcing false things about God and the other group was announcing true things. And again, the purpose of Moses and Jesus and so on wasn't to tell people the truth about God. It was to introduce laws to make people govern better. And again, we can imagine how Aquinas would disagree with that and say, no, the primary purpose of religion is to tell people the truth and to tell them what they need in life. And it's not primarily just to make them, just to introduce laws to govern them. So he goes on and he says, he gives this kind of comical description of all the things that have been deified in the Gentile religion. He says there's basically nothing that they haven't. He says, section 13, and for that part of religion which consisteth in opinions concerning the nature of powers invisible, there is almost nothing that has a name that has not been esteemed amongst the Gentiles, in one place or another, a god or devil, or by their poets feigned to be inanimated, inhabited, or possessed by some spirit or other. The unformed matter of the world was a god by the name of Chaos. The heaven, the ocean, the planets, the fire, the earth, the winds were so many gods. Men, women, a bird, a crocodile, a calf, a dog, a snake, an onion, a leek, deified. So, one time something dramatic, seemingly miraculous happened, and there was an onion there. So somebody thought this onion is the god, that this onion is divine somehow. It's this onion that made this thing happen. So they began to believe in an onion as a god. Now that might have been a joke. I don't know. There may have actually been a cult of the onion somewhere in the ancient world, but it may also just be Hobbes making a joke. But he says, all kinds of animals, all kinds of things. People came to think that they had these magical powers because, again, they didn't understand cause and effect. And they saw something dramatic, something that they really wanted to have happen, and so they thought, well, it was this snake that has this power, or a crocodile, or this type of person, or whatever. So he goes on, he continues, we won't discuss, it's a long chapter, we won't discuss every detail, sort of talks, it has an interesting point where he says, basically, ignorance of secondary causes lead people to ascribe natural processes to the gods. So they attributed procreation to Venus, creation of the arts to Apollo, so they couldn't understand how do people come to conceive of the arts. And they didn't necessarily understand all the ins and outs, all the biology of procreation, so they said, well, how exactly does procreation happen? Well, it's through the goddess Venus. And how do people come up with the arts? How do they ever imagine? How do they ever, invent these things, these ways of doing things? How do they ever come up with these ideas? And so they said, well, that was Apollo. Apollo taught people. But where does a storm come from? They couldn't understand, so they attributed that to another god or to Poseidon or something. So they attribute these things that they couldn't understand to gods. And then he goes on, and again, another interesting point says, again, and he talks about the anthropomorphism of Gentile religion, and makes an interesting point that he says, all such vices as amongst men are taken to be against the law, but not against honor, were attributed to the gods. So, for instance, lust, vengeance, and so on, things that might be against the law, but not against honor. Now, so you might say stealing, lying, of course, to some extent, Hermes was somewhat associated with those things, but his basic point is that when they think about this, things that are against the law but not against honor, things that are against the honor, cowardice, there's no god of cowardice. The things that were against honor were not considered to be caused by the gods, but things that might be against the law but were still considered honorable, more or less, lust, vengeance, things like that. Hobbes says people attributed those things to the gods. He said they were able to understand that they were able to sort of reconcile their image of the gods with producing these things. Then he goes on to some in some length. Talks about all of the ridiculousness of pagan prognostications and so on. Talks about the use that the Romans made of religion, again, basically to make people better citizens. And he's very sort of favorable about that. He says that basically the Romans knew to sort of tell the people that when bad things happened, it was because the gods were angry at them, and they were angry at them for either not doing the ceremonies or not obeying the laws, and basically acting against their religious customs, their religious beliefs and so on, and their religious commands. And so he says, therefore, people were much less likely to blame their governors for bad things that happened. Instead, they blamed themselves. They thought the gods were punishing them for their own impiety or their own wickedness or whatever. So they didn't blame the people, the governors, the people in power, the sovereign. They blamed themselves, and therefore were much more obedient, much easier to govern, much easier to rule. Then he ends the chapter by basically talking about how religions fall, and he ends with a list of particularly the ways in which the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, had introduced too many ideas that clearly benefited itself and the Pope, and therefore, Hobbes says that's obviously what led to the Reformation. And characteristically for Hobbes, a lot of what he focuses on is all the ways in which the Roman Catholic Church claimed that the church should be more powerful than the state. All the claims they made that the sovereign of every country, temporal, everyday political sovereigns were basically ultimately subservient to the church for their authority in all kinds of ways. So he talks about all the things that the Roman Church did wrong, the way that it was too clearly self-interested. and therefore made it impossible for people to believe that it was genuinely this sort of selfless religion that was just trying to teach the Gospels and teach the truth about God. But again, very characteristically for Hobbes, what he really focuses on is all the claims that the Catholic Church, and especially the Pope, made to be superior to the sovereign. All the ways in which they claimed that secular political power had to ultimately be subservient to religious power. So that's sort of Hobbes on religion. Again, you can sort of boil it down, for lack of a better word, to this idea of, fear, anxiety of the future, and ignorance of causes produces fear of powers invisible. True understanding will hopefully relieve much of that and make people much less superstitious, much less irrational.